Hi, welcome to the Business of Apps tutorial about the history of app pricing. In this tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through the history of app pricing very quickly, just to give you an idea about how this element of app monetization has evolved over the past few years to reach the point where it is today. And in particular, we're going to be looking at three major things. We're going to be just introducing you quickly to the history of app pricing and how it's evolved over time. We're going to show you how and why app pricing has shifted away from paid towards the free model. And we're going to round it off some short advice on what that might mean for your app business. Just to introduce myself quickly, I'm George. I'm the Chief Content Officer at the Business of Apps. I've worked as Head of Editorial Content for magicsolver.com for 2 years, helping the company launch dozens of apps on a global stage. And I've also worked as Events Editor for Pocket Gamer Biz, and I run my own mobile-focused blog at mobilemavericks.eu. But anyway, so app pricing. Why has app pricing changed? What's changed in the history of app pricing, and in particular, what's happened to it over the years since the App Store launched way back in 2008? Well, the main trend has been, as many of you are probably aware, that the app pricing has gone from a paid model, in which people have paid up front for their apps, to a free model, in which people have downloaded their apps for free, and then the money has been made afterwards through a source of, say, in-app purchases, advertising revenue, or some other way. And now, in the early days, of course, when people were first testing out the market, they tended to go towards this paid model, and they tended to sell software in the way that's always been traditionally sold with a price tag. And this was particularly true of, say, one of the early games on the App Store, which was Super Monkey Ball in 2008, which sold and retailed for $9.99 on the store. And between 2008 and 2011, these early apps really benefited from this paid model and were able to take advantage of the fact that consumers were willing to pay for apps. And there were some notable hits during this time, including Angry Birds and Temple Run, who managed to actually take advantage of that. But consumers became increasingly unwilling to pay for apps. And I mean, as Craig Hockenberry of Item Factory in 2008 said, I see consumers complaining about how expensive a $4.99 app is and that it should cost less. And truth be told, even though $4.99 doesn't feel that expensive when you're, say, talking about it in the physical context of maybe a cup of coffee or maybe a sandwich, when it came to people actually looking at their phones and looking at software and deciding to buy, the price tended to trend downwards. And so people were starting off saying, well, $9.99 is far too much for Super Monkey Ball. And it ended up basically that people were pushing the price downwards. And now, what were the reasons behind this? Well, it's difficult to say exactly what the reasons behind this were, but there's been a long history of mobile gaming prior to 2008 in which brands would basically release mobile games, mobile apps, or mobile software, and they would release it onto a phone, and the quality was never really there. And so consumers learned to basically be wary of mobile software. And with the rise of basically the ability to download apps straight over the internet without any particular barrier to entry, people, instead of wanting to go and pay up front for something and take that risk, became much more willing to download something for free and basically take a chance on it in that case. And so what happened with basically paid apps is that this led to the rise of the paid for free app marketing industry, in which paid apps, whether games or utilities, started to price drop in efforts to basically try and get themselves extra traction. And as people realized that if you price dropped as a paid app and then became a free app in the charts, if you were using the right advertising partners, you could sit on top of the free charts and really gain this huge traffic of interested users to either basically help transition your game towards a free model completely, or to basically use it as a way of cross-promoting within the rest of your network. But early on, it became quite clear that people weren't willing to pay for apps and that essentially there was more leverage to be reached within the free app market. And so what that led to is what's happened today, which is basically that free is taking control. And now, why did this happen? Well, in 2009, one of the major reasons why this happened is that Apple brought in the in-app purchase, which of course is the method of people going into an app and then paying for additional content or extra currency, say, by basically authorizing a payment whilst they're in the app. And now, why that was important is that essentially as the app pricing was trending towards free as consumers were unhappy to pay, developers began to realize that obviously that making an app free would help it to hit a big casual market and get installs. But if you do that and you don't have a paid revenue stream, then what do you have to do to basically make sure that you're meeting your costs? The answer is that you've got to make sure that you use another way of making money. And so basically apps began to open up to millions of downloads. And they started to use sort of service models, particularly games. They started to develop these service models in which there were basically constant updates of content, such as, say, in this game, Clash of Clans, which was released for free in 2012, and use things such as advertising within apps, in-app purchases, and in some cases subscription models to basically make sure that consumers were ready to go and pay, or particularly those dedicated handful of consumers, which is usually sort of delineated as about 3 to 5% of the market. And the result is that while paid apps, have remained within the market, games like Clash of Clans, which is one of the pioneers of this sort of freemium model, or this free-to-play model, as it's been somewhat disputedly called, they started generating over $1 million a day by about 2013. And it's driven this whole continuing cycle towards people basically going towards these free-to-play apps. And you can see this when you look at this survey from Flurry, which basically looked at the app pricing and looked at basically how many apps were paid versus free. And despite the fact that in 2011 there was arguably a minor drop between 2010 and 2011 in the number of free and paid apps, the general trend has been, as you can see, since 2011 towards increasing numbers of apps going free on the App Store. So while in 2010 only 16% of apps were paid, 10% were paid by 2013 in comparison to 90% of free apps. And it's the case that as people realised that by making their app free, they could massively increase their distribution network, it was the case that people started to realise that actually moving towards that open distribution model and working out a way of making money later was a more successful way of making money. And that in particular has been borne out on Android, which, as App Annie recently revealed, that 98% of Android app revenues come from free titles. In particular, it comes from free games, but free apps drive revenue within the Android store like no other does. Now, of course, there are some issues about that. There's some questions about user quality, for example, in comparison to iOS. But as we saw in the previous page from Flurry, roughly 90% of people are downloading free apps, or 90% of apps on the store are free on the App Store. And if 98% of Android revenues are coming from free apps, you're starting to see there quite a clear and coherent trend. And as I say, the reason why this is the case is the fact that actually you can make considerably more money with a successful free app than you can do with a paid counterpart on the other side. Free is essentially that model that allows you to open up to this big casual market, while paid goes for this niche market. And so that leads on to this little point, which is about Badland. And it really shows you really quite intelligently about how much of an impact going free can have. So essentially, the developers of Badland, which is a paid game, released their game as a paid app and had a reasonably successful 3 months in which they garnered hundreds of thousands of installs. But then, as part of Apple's 5th birthday celebrations for the App Store, they decided to make their app free as part of those celebrations. And what they saw was that in comparison to the 3 months leading up to the decision to drop their app from paid to free, they only saw 3,111 installs on average each day. Whereas during the 7-day campaign when it was free, they managed to receive over 1 million downloads each day of that campaign. Now, of course, there's some important caveats here. They did benefit a lot from Apple's promotion. They did benefit a lot from some media coverage, particularly from gaming sites and other blogs who were really keen to emphasize just quite how much of a good deal was available. But at the same time, it really showed that in the course of a week to the developer that they could really manage to make a massive impact on free to play. And despite the fact that it's only a small 2-man team who ended up making Badland, well, maybe 3 if you include some contractors, it was notable that at a recent conference, the Pocket Game Connect conference, they've said that they're actively exploring that free model now. And the reason is because it simply gives you that scope to expand, that if you've got the right materials and you've got the right team behind you, that they can really help you get towards the top of the chart. And so here are these important facts to remember. These are the important points to summarize when considering the history of app pricing industry. The first is that free is really the dominant model in the industry. Whether or not it will last, of course, that's quite difficult to say. But it seems to be the case that free is here to stay, and it seems to be that developers are much preferring the open distribution opportunities of free with the opportunity to monetize later, rather than taking the risk on paid apps. Nevertheless, paid apps do have a niche role to play in the industry. If there's a certain type of game which has a very distinct idea, or there's a certain app that has a very distinct usage as opposed to being, say, a service app, then you can probably, presumably, sell an app along those models. But ultimately, and this is going to be a point that I'm sure we'll explore in future tutorials, the best model for you is the best model for your business. So the fact that free is successful or that paid is successful with certain types of developers, the reason why it succeeds is not just the model in itself, it's the people who execute it, it's the team who are behind it. And so as you'll probably realise in sort of future tutorials when we explore this topic, you'll probably end up seeing that certain apps particularly certain paid apps or certain free apps, have succeeded because they've had the right team to succeed. So really, when you're doing it, you've got to think about making sure that you know which model works best for you. But basically, that's it from this short little tutorial. We're going to be exploring that third point in particular in more of our videos about monetization. So make sure you go and check out the Business of Apps YouTube blog and go and check out businessofapps.com to make sure that you see the rest of those videos as they go live. Thanks very much for watching.